It wasn't until they were safely beyond the door that Mr. Sitwell realized a few people seated nearby were watching him. He had spoken too loudly, behaved inappropriately, and now apparently the guests were disturbed. The only thing to do in such circumstances was smile. "Begging your pardon, ladies and gents." He grinned as he tucked Mac's bottle in the crook of his right arm. "There seems to have been some confusion as to who has earned the privilege of serving you this evening." With a flourish, he spun Bart's tray around and then set it on his right forearm. He reached for an empty glass on one of the side tables, picked it up with his free hand, then flipped it in the air so that they could watch it land right side up on his tray. He repeated the trick 4 times, which seemed to sufficiently soothe their alarm. A few of them began to applaud. The Rib King by Ladee Hubbard. When I picked up this book, The Rib King, I didn't know what I was picking up. I thought I was picking up a different book. I had heard about or read about this book called Deacon King Kong back in like November. And that book is set in 1960s Brooklyn and is about a deacon who goes into this courtyard in front of a bunch of people and at point blank range shoots this drug dealer. Moving into January, when I started looking at 2021 new releases, I realized that it would take a while for these books to become available to me through the library. So in the meantime, in between time, I started looking through like ebooks that were available to be borrowed right away, and I came across The Rib King. I don't know if it's the color of the books because they're sort of yellow, orangish, or if it's like the graphics on the front that have this sort of abstract feel to them, or just the fact that both books have the word king in the title. But I saw The Rib King and I thought that it was Deacon King Kong, right? So when I picked up The Rib King, I didn't even bother to read the synopsis. I just thought that this is what I was reading. So that I was reading Deacon King Kong. So for the first 3-4 chapters of The Rib King, I'm wondering like, this doesn't feel like Brooklyn. And where's the church? Where's the deacon? Where are the drugs? I was very confused. I was very disoriented. And that definitely impacted my first impression of this story. I didn't even realize it on my own. I was surfing the internet during the time that I was reading this book, and literally an ad for Deacon King Kong came up, and I realized, oh, that's the book that I thought I was reading. By then, I was already invested in the characters, so I just kept reading. This story begins in 1914, 1915 in the Midwest, and we're introduced to Mr. Sitwell, who is one of a handful of black servants working for the Barclays. Now, Mr. and Mr. Barclay have been wealthy for years, but lately their money has been running out and they're basically about to lose it all if Mr. Barclay isn't able to close a number of like real estate and other business deals. So while Barclay is, clearly has this sense that he's single-handedly closing these deals and saving his family, his household, the staff in his home are actually the ones behind the scene pulling everything together. Then you have these 3 boys, Frederick, Bart, and Mac, who are orphans and who are working in the Barclay house. So the Barclays have for years have taken young black boys from this orphan asylum, brought them to be reformed in their home, and trained them, basically getting free or nearly free labor in the name of civilizing these young boys. Mr. Sitwell is in fact one of these former, trainees. It's just that he has been allowed to continue working. So then we have Sitwell, who understands the plight of these boys, but who has over the years made it a point to not get involved. And you get the sense that Sitwell doesn't get involved because in this world that doesn't value the safety and security of young black boys, let alone anyone who is black, just how much of a task it is for a black man to try and protect young black boys. Even though Sitwell hasn't in the past gotten involved with these 3 boys, he feels very much responsible for them. And yet, the presence of these boys has brought up some past trauma that Sitwell has experienced, and that starts to bubble as well. Then at some point, someone offers Mr. Barclay money to commercialize a sauce that Miss Mamie has served them, and to use Mr. Sitwell's likeness for the branding. And so the decision is made with no consideration to what Miss Mamie, who's the cook, wants, or what Mr. Sitwell wants. "Wait a minute, Barclay," Mr. Pound called out. "Is that the same one from earlier? The one that does that trick?" He turned to his wife. "This man is possessed of the most amusing talent. Barclay, you must show my wife." "Of course," Barclay said. "Sitwell?" Mr. Sitwell set the tray on the side table. "Would one of the ladies be kind enough to lend me a handkerchief?" Mr. Barclay smiled. "Give him mine," Mrs. Pound said. She handed her handkerchief to her husband, who in turn passed it to Mr. Barclay. Mr. Barclay held it to his nose and smiled. "As I suspected, it retains the scent of your perfume." He handed it to Mr. Sitwell. "Now, Mr. Sitwell, will you kindly tell our assembled guests what that perfume is composed of?" Mr. Sitwell held it to his nose. "An elegant composition consisting of essences of lemon, bergamot, neroli, rosemary, petitgrain, myrtle, and cedarwood." Mr. Barclay nodded. "Is that all?" Mr. Sitwell inhaled again. "A hint of sandalwood to round out the aroma." "How marvelous!" Mrs. Pound squealed. "I'll have you know that is one of the most expensive perfumes in all Paris." "Well, I must say, dear," Mrs. Barclay said, "if that is all it is made of, it sounds to me as if perhaps you were overcharged." She seemed to enjoy the laughter this comment produced. "An amusing talent," Mr. Barclay said, "even if it serves no real purpose." So I'll start with, the couple things that I didn't enjoy as much. I will rarely read a story where it starts out one way and then halfway through you're taken to a different place in time or a different point of view character. Those just aren't my favorite types of stories to read. And that's what happens in this story. You start out with Mr. Sitwell's point of view, and about halfway through you go to another character. I will say though that I was invested in all of the characters by then. I wanted to know what happened to them. And so even though the tone of the story changed quite a bit when that POV changed, I couldn't stop reading because I wanted to know what happened. So what did I enjoy about this story? I love that it was unpredictable. Half of the time I was trying to guess what would happen and I was wrong. The other half of the time I just couldn't even figure out what my guess would be about what was coming next. I definitely was invested in the characters, so the story did a really great job of pulling me in and having me worry about their well-being. There were several moments in this book where I didn't think people were going to make it or was trying to figure out how they were going to get themselves out of just a crazy situation. I loved how the historical pieces were woven into the story. It made me want to go and research, that time period and things that were happening in that area at that time, which I'll go into in a minute. Also, somehow, even though the story was like uncomfortable to read sometimes, there were also really light and funny moments. Something that I found interesting when I was reading this book, if you've ever watched The Long Walk Home with Whoopi Goldberg and Sissy Spacek, I would say actually that was a little triggering for me, because in The Long Walk Home, there's this one scene in particular that I remember where Whoopi Goldberg's character and this other maid are serving Sissy Spacek's character and her family. And so while the black maids are serving dinner to this white family and their guests, the white people are talking about how disrespectful and ungrateful, and that black people are. And so these women are just, they have no choice really but to continue serving food, putting soup in someone's bowl as they're saying, yeah, the darkies are this and they don't do this and they don't want to work for anything and they're lazy. This story had a lot of moments like that. And so I found it to be triggering, not like, oh, this was bad for the author to write that, just like infuriating. Like, the book made me feel a lot of feels. The guests laughed and smiled, then began to demand their own demonstrations in turn. Mr. Sitwell sniffed and recited the contents of the perfumes on 4 more handkerchiefs and the ingredients of a stick of chewing gum. Then he recited the different vintages of 3 glasses of wine. Finally, he heard the tinkling of a little bell, turned around, and saw Mamie smiling in the doorway. "Dinner is served," she announced. The guests stood up and walked to the dining room. Mr. Sitwell stayed behind to collect their empty glasses. Jenny came out to help. "I see I'm not the only performer in this house," she said. "Hardly. Everyone danced for money in this world," Mr. Sitwell thought. The jailer danced for the rich man danced for his investors. Mr. Sitwell, it sometimes seemed, danced for all of them at once. So after I finished reading The Rib King, even though I generally enjoyed the book, I really felt like there were some layers that I missed. Like, I knew they were there, but I couldn't quite understand what they were. So what I did was I found an interview that the author, Ladee Hubbard, did about this book. And I found out that The Rib King is actually a prequel. It's a prequel to Ladee Hubbard's debut novel, The Talented Ribkins, which is about this family in Florida, and every member of the family has some supernatural power, and they have this patriarch named the Rib King. But the Rib King does not actually show up in The Talented Ribkin. They talk about him, but he doesn't actually show up in the story. But what they do have is this can of sauce that has this caricature of the Rib King on it. So this is the only like tangible memory that the family, the Ribkins, have of the Rib King. And so that was very interesting. And then Ladee said that when she was writing the Rib King, she was thinking about this time period in America where commodities are becoming more and more available to people. We're having all of these world's fairs, and this is where I believe she said like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and other mass-produced products were being invented or unveiled. And so at this time period, which is not too far after the end of slavery, you have commodities being attached to Black identities at the same time that Black people are fighting to be recognized as citizens, as equal citizens, and as human beings. And so when she has these two point of views, Mr. Sitwell and this other character's point of view, she's trying to show how these two characters sort of wrestle with what's going on in America at that time. And she was also inspired by the Trayvon Martin verdict, which I think happened in 2013. And so Ladee she wanted to write about sort of the trauma, the tensions, the decisions that caregivers face, caregivers of Black boys, Black children face. And so both characters, Mr. Sitwell and this other POV character, dealt with that as well. And so I thought that was really interesting. And once I found that out, I actually wanted to go back and reread the book again, because I thought if I knew this going in, I probably would have picked up on some things. But I mean, that's just how it is when you're reading. But I do want to read The Talented Ribkin. So that's definitely a book that's been added to my TBR. Something else interesting that Ladee said was that all of the factual information inside the Rib King, the historical information inside the Rib King, came from a paper that she wrote about the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. I thought that was really cool. So that's it for The Rib King. Let me know if you've read this book, if you want to read this book, if you read The Talented Ribkins, because I would love to know about that too. And that's it.